Boy returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind where the world felt alive, buzzing with energy and possibility. Jake and his friends were exploring the outskirts of their small town, a place dotted with abandoned warehouses and forgotten buildings. For Jake, these crumbling structures were a treasure trove of adventure. He was always the ringleader, the one with the daring ideas that his friends couldn't resist. Today was no different. The boys gathered around a particularly old building, its brick walls cracked and covered in graffiti. "Let's climb to the top," Jake declared, his eyes sparkling with excitement. His friends hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. "Are you sure? That thing doesn't look safe," one of them muttered. But Jake waved off their concerns with a grin. "It's fine, just follow me." Jake scrambled up the side of the building, his hands gripping the weathered metal ladder that clung precariously to the wall. His friends reluctantly followed, their nerves growing with each creak of the rusted rungs. Once they reached the roof, the view took their breath away. The entire town sprawled out below them, bathed in golden sunlight. Jake stood at the edge, arms outstretched as if he were on top of the world. "See, I told you it was worth it," he shouted over his shoulder. His friends laughed nervously, staying well back from the edge. Jake, ever the thrill-seeker, began edging closer, peering down at the ground far below. "Come on, don't be scared," he teased, turning to face them. In that instant, his foot slipped on a loose piece of gravel. Time seemed to slow. Jake's arms flailed as he struggled to regain his balance, but gravity had already claimed him. The last thing he saw was the panicked faces of his friends as he plummeted downward. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, and everything went black. Jake opened his eyes, but instead of the chaos of his surroundings, he saw nothing. No ground, no sky, just an infinite expanse of soft, glowing light. He felt weightless, suspended in this strange void. Panic rose in his chest, but before it could take hold, a sense of warmth and peace washed over him. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The pain from his fall was gone, replaced by a serene calm. "Where am I?" Jake thought, his voice echoing in the emptiness. As if in response, the light around him began to shift and swirl, forming shapes and colors that defied description. He felt himself being drawn forward, not by any force he could see, but by a deep, instinctual pull. Soon, the light gave way to a scene of breathtaking beauty. Jake found himself in a place that seemed both familiar and otherworldly. The air was alive with music, soft, melodic tones that resonated deep within his soul. Flowers bloomed in vibrant, impossible hues, and the ground beneath his feet shimmered like polished gold. He realized he wasn't alone. Figures of light moved around him, their forms indistinct, but radiating a kindness and love that brought tears to his eyes. One of the figures stepped forward, and Jake instinctively knew this being was special. It reached out, not with words, but with a feeling, inviting him closer. Jake felt safe, more safe than he'd ever felt in his life. As he moved toward the figure, he noticed others beginning to gather, their glowing forms filling the space with an indescribable energy. It was as if he were being welcomed home. Before Jake could ask any questions, a voice unlike any he had ever heard filled the space. It was powerful, yet gentle, commanding yet full of compassion. "Jake," the voice said, and the sound of his name reverberated through his entire being. He turned, and there, standing before him, was a presence that could only be described as divine. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure radiated a light so pure it was almost blinding, but it didn't hurt his eyes. Instead, it filled him with awe and love. "You are not alone," the voice continued. "You are here for a purpose." Jake felt a lump in his throat. Who are you?" he managed to whisper. The figure smiled, and in that smile, Jake saw the answer. It was Jesus, not as an image he had seen in books or paintings, but as a presence so real it left no room for doubt. The overwhelming sense of peace he had felt since arriving here intensified, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. "You have a life yet to live," Jesus said, his voice filled with a love so profound it brought Jake to his knees. "But there is something you must see, something you must understand, before you return." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He felt as though his entire existence had led to this moment. Jesus reached out and touched Jake's shoulder. The world around them shifted again, and Jake felt himself being pulled into a vision, one that would change his life forever. Jake found himself standing in a vast, ever-changing landscape. It wasn't like the glowing serenity of the place he had just left. This was a tapestry of moving images, events, and people. Scenes of cities, towns, and countries stretched out before him as though he were looking at the entire world all at once. He saw laughter and joy, people working together, families embracing. But just as quickly, those scenes were replaced by others, images of chaos, division, and despair. Fires burned in the streets, people shouted angrily, and leaders stood at podiums, their faces etched with stress and fear. Jesus stood beside him, his presence steady amidst the shifting scenes. His eyes, filled with both love and sorrow, fixed on Jake. "The world is at a crossroads," Jesus said, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made Jake's heart ache. "There is much good, much hope. But there are also forces at work, forces that seek to divide, to corrupt, and to lead many astray." Jake swallowed hard, his gaze darting between the images. "What can I do? I'm just a kid," he asked, his voice trembling. Jesus smiled gently. "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. What you have seen, what you will share, can inspire others to reflect and act with faith, love, and vigilance. But there is something I must show you, something critical for the times ahead." The images slowed, focusing now on a single figure. Jake saw a man he recognized immediately, Donald Trump. He was standing in a large room, surrounded by people. Some were advisors, others were strangers Jake didn't recognize. Their faces were a mixture of concern, determination, and, in some cases, cunning. Trump himself looked both confident and burdened, as though he were carrying an invisible weight. "Why are you showing me him?" Jake asked, turning to Jesus. "Because he plays a pivotal role in what is to come," Jesus replied. "He has been given influence over many, and his decisions ripple across the world. But with great influence comes great responsibility, and the path he walks is not easy. There are those who seek to guide him toward what is right, and there are those who wish to use him for their own gain." Jake watched as the scene shifted. He saw Trump speaking at a rally, his words stirring both hope and division among the crowd. Then the image changed again, showing Trump in private moments, sitting at a desk, his head in his hands. Papers were scattered around him, and his expression was one of deep contemplation. Jake felt a pang of empathy. For the first time, he saw not just a public figure, but a man carrying immense pressure. "What can I do about this?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can remind the world of what truly matters," Jesus said. "Faith, humility, and vigilance. No leader is perfect, and none can succeed alone. It is up to the people to pray, to guide, and to hold their leaders accountable with love and truth." Jake nodded slowly, trying to absorb the enormity of what he was being shown. But what if they don't listen? What if they don't believe me? Jesus placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and Jake felt a surge of strength. Do not underestimate the power of truth spoken with courage. Even a single voice can ignite change. Your role is not to force others to believe, but to plant the seed. The rest is in their hands and in God's. The scene shifted once more. Jake was now standing in a shadowy landscape, far darker than anything he had seen before. The air felt heavy, and the sounds of anguish and despair filled his ears. He saw people arguing, families torn apart, and leaders consumed by greed and power. At the center of it all was a swirling darkness, a force that seemed to feed on fear and hatred. "This is what happens when vigilance is lost," Jesus said, his tone somber. "When people allow themselves to be divided, when they place power above principle, this darkness grows." Jake's heart raced as the darkness seemed to reach for him, its tendrils curling like smoke. But Jesus raised a hand, and the shadows recoiled. "It is not inevitable," Jesus continued. "Light can overcome even the deepest darkness, but it requires faith, courage, and unity." Jake turned to Jesus, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "I'll do it. I'll share what you've shown me. I'll try to help." Jesus smiled, a look of profound love and gratitude on his face. "I chose you because of your heart, Jake. Never forget that even the smallest act of faith can change the course of history." Jake felt the warmth of Jesus' hand on his shoulder again, and the darkness faded. The world around him was filled with light once more, and he realized that he was being drawn back, pulled toward his own body. Jesus' voice echoed in his ears as everything began to blur. "Be strong, Jake. And remember, you are never alone." Jake found himself immersed in darkness once again, but this time it wasn't peaceful or serene. It was heavy, oppressive, and suffocating. The air felt thick, and an eerie silence was broken only by distant whispers, faint yet filled with malice. Shadows crept along the ground, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized this was no ordinary place. This was the darkness Jesus had warned him about. Ahead of him, the shadows began to take shape. Figures emerged, distorted, grotesque representations of humanity. Some appeared as leaders, their faces twisted with greed and power. Others were ordinary people, consumed by anger and division, their hands clutching at invisible chains. The sight was overwhelming, and Jake felt his knees weaken. He wanted to look away, but an unseen force kept his gaze fixed on the horrifying spectacle. "This is the cost of turning away from light," a voice echoed around him. It was Jesus, though Jake could not see him in the shadows. When people allow fear, hatred, and pride to guide them, this darkness thrives. It feeds on division, on selfishness, and on the loss of faith. Jake tried to steady his breathing as he watched the shadows grow larger, enveloping everything in their path. He saw entire communities consumed, their once bright lights extinguished. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of anger, despair, and lies. Jake's chest tightened, and tears streamed down his face. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "To understand the stakes," Jesus replied gently. "You must know what is at risk. The world is not beyond saving, but it requires vigilance. People must choose love over hate, truth over lies, and faith over fear. That choice begins with each individual." Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, small but unwavering. Jake focused on it, and as he did, the whispers seemed to recede. The light grew stronger, and within it, he saw people coming together, helping each other, praying, and standing united against the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled, retreating as the light spread. "This is what happens when people choose faith," Jesus said. "Even the smallest acts of kindness and courage can push back the darkness." Jake felt a spark of hope ignite within him. He wiped his tears and straightened his back, determined to carry this message forward. But as the light grew, the world around him began to blur. The once clear visions faded, replaced by a swirling void. Jake realized he was being pulled back to the world he had left behind. With a sudden gasp, Jake opened his eyes. Pain shot through his body as reality came crashing back. He was lying on a stretcher, surrounded by paramedics. His family was nearby, their faces pale with fear and worry. His mother was clutching his hand, whispering his name. Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his body felt heavy. He blinked, struggling to process what had happened. "You're awake," one of the paramedics said, relief evident in his voice. "We've got you, kid. You're going to be okay." Jake wanted to tell them everything, but his words wouldn't come. Instead, he closed his eyes and focused on the memories of what he had seen and heard. The weight of the message he carried pressed down on him, but so did a deep sense of purpose. He knew he had been given a second chance, and he couldn't waste it. Days passed, and Jake remained in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The doctors were amazed at his resilience, calling it nothing short of miraculous. His family hovered around him, their relief palpable. But Jake's mind was elsewhere. He replayed the visions in his head, trying to piece together how he would share them. The task felt monumental, and doubt crept in. One evening, as the sun set and the hospital room was bathed in golden light, Jake finally spoke. His parents were sitting by his bed, holding his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. His mother and father leaned in, their expressions filled with concern. Jake took a deep breath and began recounting everything. Falling, the void of light, meeting Jesus, and the warnings he had been given. At first, his parents listened in stunned silence. His mother's eyes filled with tears, while his father's brow furrowed with disbelief. But as Jake continued, the passion and sincerity in his voice broke through their doubts. "Jake," his mother said softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. This is incredible. But are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" Jake nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This wasn't a dream, Mum. It was real. Jesus told me I have to share this. People need to know." His father, usually a stoic man, placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "If this is what you believe, then we'll stand by you, whatever it takes." The conversation gave Jake a renewed sense of determination. Over the next few days, he began writing down everything he had seen and heard, pouring his heart into each word. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. The world needed to hear the truth, even if it meant facing skepticism and ridicule. By the time Jake was discharged from the hospital, he was ready. He had a plan, a mission, and a burning desire to make a difference. As he stepped out into the sunlight, he looked up at the sky, silently thanking Jesus for the second chance he had been given. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it with courage and faith. The buzz of conversation filled the living room as Jake's family gathered with close friends and neighbors, all curious about the boy's miraculous recovery. Word had spread quickly in their small town about his near-death experience, and Jake had insisted on sharing his story in person. At first, his parents were hesitant. They worried about how people would react, but Jake's determination won them over. He sat at the center of the room, a mix of nervousness and resolve etched on his young face. When everyone had settled, Jake took a deep breath and began. He spoke with a clarity and conviction that surprised even himself. He recounted every detail: the fall, the light, the encounter with Jesus, and the visions of both hope and despair. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him as he described the warning he had been given about the world's crossroads and the responsibility of leaders, including Donald Trump. to guide with humility and vigilance. Some listeners nodded, moved by his words, while others exchanged skeptical glances. But Jake pressed on, undeterred. He spoke not to convince, but to share, trusting that the truth of his experience would resonate with those who were ready to hear it. "It's not just about leaders," he said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. Every single one of us has a role to play in pushing back the darkness. It starts with how we treat each other, with love, kindness, and faith." By the time he finished, the room was quiet. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Jake's grandmother, her eyes glistening with tears, stood and embraced him. "I believe you," she said softly, and her words seemed to break the dam. Others began to speak up, sharing their thoughts, their own experiences, and their hopes for the future. The gathering marked the beginning of something much larger than Jake had anticipated. People began asking him to share his story in other settings, at schools, churches, and community centers. His parents were cautious, worried about the strain it might put on him, but Jake reassured them. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the message." As Jake spoke to larger audiences, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were drawn to his sincerity and the profound simplicity of his message. He didn't claim to have all the answers, nor did he try to dictate how others should live. Instead, he encouraged them to reflect, to pray, and to act with integrity in their own lives. One day, Jake was invited to speak at a regional youth conference. The event was held in a large auditorium, and as Jake stepped onto the stage, the sight of hundreds of faces staring back at him made his heart race. But he remembered Jesus' words, "You are never alone," and the fear melted away. He began to speak, pouring his heart into every word. Jake shared the vision of light and darkness, describing how even the smallest acts of kindness could push back the shadows. He urged the audience to pray for their leaders, especially those in positions of great influence. "They're just people," he said. "They need our support, our prayers, and sometimes our courage to remind them of what's right." When Jake finished, the crowd erupted in applause. But what struck him most were the conversations that followed. Young people approached him, sharing their own struggles and hopes. Some asked how they could make a difference, while others simply thanked him for giving them a renewed sense of purpose. As Jake continued to share his story, the message spread beyond his small town. News outlets picked up on his story, framing it as the extraordinary tale of a boy who had returned from the brink of death with a message of hope and warning. Some treated it as a miracle, while others were skeptical, dismissing it as a figment of a young boy's imagination. But Jake didn't let the critics faze him. He knew his mission wasn't to convince everyone. It was to plant seeds of change. One night, as Jake sat at his desk, writing down his thoughts, his father walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing something important, Jake," he said. "But don't forget to be a kid, too. It's okay to take breaks." Jake smiled and nodded, appreciating his father's concern. "I know, Dad, but I feel like I don't have time to waste. There's so much to do." His father sighed, then handed him a small, well-worn Bible. "Whenever you feel overwhelmed, remember where your strength comes from." Jake took the Bible, feeling its weight in his hands, and nodded. "Thanks, Dad." As the weeks turned into months, Jake's story continued to inspire. Communities organized prayer events, people reconnected with their faith, and conversations about love, unity, and vigilance spread. Jake knew he was just one voice among many, but he also knew that sometimes one voice was enough to start a movement. On the anniversary of his fall, Jake returned to the rooftop where it all began. He stood at the edge, looking out over the town, his heart filled with gratitude. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, thanking Jesus for the second chance he had been given and asking for strength to continue his mission. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Jake opened his eyes, a sense of peace washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it with courage, faith, and the unwavering belief that even the smallest light could shine brightly in the darkest of times.